Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight we drift back nearly 2,300 years to a rocky, wind-scoured stretch of the Balkan coast, where a newborn is being wrapped hastily in rough cloth, passed hand to hand in the dark, while men with drawn swords search the palace rooms behind them for a boy they mean to kill. This is not a gentle bedtime tale of kings and castles. This is the story of a child who survives assassins before he can walk, who grows into perhaps the finest battlefield general the ancient world ever produced, and who still somehow becomes a byword for the kind of victory nobody wants. If you think you would have made better choices standing in his sandals, you probably won't survive this one. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and your local time down in the comments. I love knowing where in the world this story is finding you tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The kingdom is called Epirus, a rugged patchwork of mountains and pastureland tucked along the northwestern edge of Greece, more sheep country than shining marble city, but proud all the same, and ruled by a dynasty that claims descent from the hero Achilles himself. The infant's father is Aeacides, king of the Molossians, the dominant tribe of Epirus, and his mother is a woman named Phthia. For a few years, the family's grip on the throne seems secure enough, but Epirot politics in this era are less a system of government and more a rotating door of coups, exiles, and blood feuds between rival noble houses, each one convinced the crown belongs to them. When Aeacides backs the losing side in a war against neighbouring Macedon, the nobles of Epirus turn on him. He is deposed. And in the chaos that follows, with rival factions circling and old scores waiting to be settled, the baby prince becomes a target too dangerous to leave alive. Picture the scene, because this is where the story truly begins. It is somewhere around 319 years before the Common Era, though historians still argue over the exact date. The palace corridors are full of shouting. Loyal servants scoop up the infant and run not towards safety exactly, but toward whatever direction is furthest from the men hunting him. They reach a river swollen from recent rain, its current fast and brown, and utterly indifferent to the fact that a kingdom's future is balanced on its banks. There is no bridge, no ferry, nothing but water and darkness, and the sound of pursuit somewhere behind them. And here is what you have to understand about ancient infant mortality, about how fragile life already was for any newborn in this world, let alone one being smuggled across a flooded river at night. The odds are not good. The men carrying the child call out into the dark to farmers on the opposite bank begging for help crossing. The farmers understandably are not eager to wade into a raging river for a group of frantic strangers shouting from the shadows. So one of the attendants does something almost absurd in its desperation. He peels a strip of bark from a tree and, using blood, scratches out a message explaining who the child is and what is at stake, then hurls it wrapped around a stone across the water. It lands. It is read, and the farmers, moved by the plea, form a human chain and wade out to bring the child across. This is the kind of detail that sounds almost too cinematic to be true, and yet it comes down to us through ancient historians who found it worth preserving precisely because everyone who told this story afterward understood they were describing the origin of somebody extraordinary. The boy is given the name Pyrrhus, meaning something like the Red One, or flame-coloured, depending on which ancient etymology you trust. He is carried onward further into exile, eventually finding refuge in the court of Glaucius, king of the Illyrians, a rougher and less Hellenized people to the north. Glaucius could easily have handed the child over. Epirus's new rulers certainly ask him to. Instead, according to the story, when the toddler is brought before him and reportedly crawls straight toward the king and clutches at his robes, Glaucius is struck by something. Call it fate, call it good theatre, call it a shrewd read of future political leverage, and decides to protect the boy. Pyrrhus grows up in that foreign court, a guest and a hostage in equal measure, watching his homeland from a distance, learning the brutal grammar of Balkan power politics from the outside looking in. This is a formative kind of childhood, the sort that either breaks a person or forges them into something unusually hard and unusually determined. For Pyrrhus it does the latter. He does not grow up soft, He grows up watching alliances shift like weather, watching kings rise and fall within a single season, and absorbing a lesson that will define his entire adult life. Nothing is permanent. Thrones are always contested, and the only real security is the sword in your own hand and the loyalty of the men standing beside you. By the time he is a teenager, he is already itching to reclaim what was taken from him in that chaotic infancy, not out of simple nostalgia, but because in his world a king without a throne is nothing at all, a rumor, a ghost, a story people will eventually stop telling. And there is a quieter, stranger detail worth sitting with. Before we move forward, ancient writers claim Pyrrhus had an unusual physical trait, upper and lower teeth on his upper jaw, fused into a single continuous piece of bone, rather than separate teeth, and that he later used this oddity to perform something like a folk cure, touching his right foot to the chests of the sick to relieve pain in the spleen. Whether true or embellished by admirers eager to mark him as destined for greatness, it tells you something about how people already spoke of him, half man, half legend, before he had won a single battle. That legend is about to be tested, because across the sea, in a city most Greeks still consider a backwater of unruly farmers, something is stirring that will one day pull this exiled prince into the greatest gamble of his life. The years in Illyrian exile do not last forever, because nothing in this world of shifting alliances ever does. Back in Epirus, the men who seized the throne proved less capable of holding it than they were of taking it. And the old loyalties to the Aeacid line the family descended, so the story goes, from Achilles himself never quite die out among the mountain clans and shepherd villages of Molossia. When Pyrrhus is around 12 years old, King Glaucias marches him back into Epirus with an armed escort, not to seize the throne outright, but to plant him back into the political landscape, a living reminder that the old dynasty still breathes. It works for a while. The boy is restored, propped up as a child king with regents managing the actual governance around him. And here is what you have to understand about being a child king in this era. You are less a ruler and more a symbol, a piece on someone else's board, and the moment you stop being useful to the people protecting you, you become expendable. That moment arrives when Pyrrhus is around 17. He leaves Epirus to attend a wedding, one of his relatives marrying into the Illyrian royal family, a happy occasion, the kind of event where a young prince might reasonably let his guard down for an evening. While he is away, his enemies at home seize their opening. A rebellion erupts, his regime is toppled, and by the time word reaches him at the wedding feast, there is no home left to return to. Once again, at an age when most of his peers are worrying about far smaller things, Pyrrhus finds himself a king without a kingdom, standing in someone else's banquet hall with nothing but the clothes on his back and whatever goodwill he can still call in from powerful friends. This is where a lesser person might have folded. Instead, Pyrrhus does something that will become the defining pattern of his entire life. He attaches himself to the strongest available patron and starts climbing back up. He makes his way to the court of Antigonus the One-Eyed and his son Demetrius, two of the most formidable warlords left over from the wreckage of Alexander the Great's empire. Men still fighting over the pieces of that shattered inheritance decades after Alexander's death. Pyrrhus fights alongside Demetrius and by most accounts fights extraordinarily well, earning a reputation on the battlefield at an age when most young nobles are still training with wooden swords. At the pivotal Battle of Ipsus, one of the great collisions between Alexander's squabbling successors, Pyrrhus distinguishes himself enough that people start to notice this exiled Epirot teenager has something rare, not just courage, but an instinct for combat that seems almost inherited, almost inevitable. Eventually, his path leads him into the orbit of Ptolemy, the successor who has carved out Egypt for himself and founded a dynasty that will eventually produce Cleopatra centuries later. Pyrrhus is sent to Alexandria technically as a hostage, guaranteeing a peace treaty between warring factions, but hostage-taking among Hellenistic royalty rarely resembles a dungeon. Instead, Pyrrhus lives in one of the most dazzling cities on earth, the great library still being assembled, the harbour crowded with ships from across the known world, and he makes himself charming enough, capable enough that Ptolemy takes a genuine liking to him. Ptolemy's wife Berenice apparently likes him even more and arranges for Pyrrhus to marry her daughter Antigone. Suddenly, the penniless exile has married into the ruling family of Egypt, one of the wealthiest and most powerful kingdoms on the planet. And here is the dry irony worth pausing on. Pyrrhus spends his entire life fighting brutal, exhausting campaigns to win kingdoms by force, when some of his biggest breaks come simply from being likable at dinner parties. It is almost enough to make you wonder if he took the harder path on purpose. With Ptolemy's backing, soldiers' money, and crucially legitimacy, Pyrrhus returns to Epirus around the year 297 before the Common Era and reclaims his throne, this time with enough force behind him that the old game of palace coups becomes considerably harder to play against him. He does not rule alone at first. He shares power uneasily with a rival claimant, a cousin named Neoptolemus, in an arrangement that satisfies no one, least of all Pyrrhus, who has already learned the hard way that divided power in this world tends to end in daggers rather than compromise. And true to that grim education, it does end that way. Ancient sources describe a tense banquet, mutual suspicion curdling into open plotting, and Pyrrhus striking first, having Neoptolemus killed before Neoptolemus can do the same to him. It is ugly, it is ruthless, and by the standards of Hellenistic royal politics, it is also simply how business gets done. By his early 20s, Pyrrhus is sole king of Epirus, a battle-tested commander with connections stretching from Macedon to Egypt, and a reputation already spreading that he might be something more than just another squabbling princeling. Whispers begin comparing him to Alexander the Great himself, not merely in ambition but in raw tactical gift. The kind of comparison that could get a man killed for arrogance if he weren't actually good enough to back it up. Pyrrhus, as it happens, is good enough to back it up. He expands his territory, meddles successfully in Macedonian succession, disputes briefly, even holds part of the Macedonian throne itself before losing it again in the endless churn of Hellenistic power struggles. But holding a modest mountain kingdom, however impressively won, is not enough for a man who has grown up believing, who has been told outright by the flattering courtiers around him that he carries something of Alexander's own destiny in his blood. Epirus is small, Epirus is poor. And somewhere across the sea, in a world Pyrrhus has barely glimpsed, a rising power is about to make a mistake that will hand him the opportunity he has been waiting for. His entire turbulent life, a chance not just to rule, but to conquer. To understand what pulls Pyrrhus toward his true destiny, you have to sit with him for a moment in the quieter hours away from the battlefield glory and the palace intrigue, and understand what actually occupies his mind. And here is what you have to understand about Pyrrhus specifically, something that separates him from most of the other successor kings. Scrambling over Alexander's broken empire, he does not simply want territory. He wants to be Alexander, not metaphorically, not in some vague aspirational sense. He genuinely measures his own life, his own choices, his own worth as a man against the yardstick of a conqueror who died only a generation or two before he was born, who marched an army from Greece to India and back, who reshaped the known world before the age of 33. That is the shadow Pyrrhus lives inside, and it is both his greatest fuel and, as we will come to see across these next several sections, something close to a curse. The comparisons are not simply Pyrrhus's own vanity either, though he certainly does nothing to discourage them. His mother's side of the family, the Aeacid dynasty, claims descent from Achilles, and through a tangle of Epirot and Macedonian royal marriages, Pyrrhus is genuinely a blood relative of Alexander, a second cousin by most reckonings, through Alexander's mother Olympias, who was herself an Epirot princess. This is not some flattering court fiction invented after the fact. The bloodline is real, close enough that when people at the time whisper that Pyrrhus resembles Alexander, that he carries something of Alexander's ferocity and brilliance, they are not simply grasping for a compliment, they are noticing a genuine family resemblance, both physical and temperamental, that unsettles rivals and thrills soldiers in equal measure. One particular anecdote retold by several ancient historians captures how deeply this comparison follows him. When Pyrrhus is asked later in life who he considers the greatest general of the age, he reportedly ranks himself just behind Alexander, not out of false modesty, but because even Pyrrhus, a man not exactly famous for humility, cannot bring himself to claim the very top spot is his. Alexander occupies a category of his own in Pyrrhus's mind, untouchable, the North Star, by which every other general's greatness gets measured, including especially Pyrrhus's own. And here is the darker undercurrent worth sitting with, because it is going to matter enormously as this story unfolds. Alexander's story, for all its dazzling conquest, is also a cautionary tale about a man who could never stop marching, who kept pushing toward the next horizon, even as his own army begged for rest, even as his own body began failing him from wounds and fever and exhaustion. Dying at 32, having never truly settled into simply governing what he had already won, Pyrrhus absorbs the glory of that story completely. What he does not seem to absorb, at least not until it is far too late, is the warning buried inside it. Historians still argue over how much of Pyrrhus's restlessness was simple ambition, and how much was something closer to compulsion, an inability to sit still on any single throne once it stopped presenting fresh challenges. What is not in dispute is the pattern of his actual life, kingdom after kingdom, campaign after campaign, each one abandoned or lost the moment a shinier opportunity appeared over the horizon. Even now, secure as king of Epirus, expanded and respected, Pyrrhus is already restless. Epirus, for all his hard-won control over it, is fundamentally a small mountain kingdom on the fringes of the Greek world, sheep pastures and hill forts, nothing like the glittering empire his cousin once carved out of Persia and beyond. He surrounds himself during these years with a particular kind of advisor, men skilled in rhetoric and persuasion, none more important than a Thessalian named Cineas, a former student of the famous orator Demosthenes, and a man whose intelligence and diplomatic skill will matter enormously later in this story. Cineas becomes something close to Pyrrhus's conscience, the one voice in his court willing to ask uncomfortable questions about where all this ambition is actually leading. We will meet him properly in his finest and most poignant moment several sections from now. For the moment, simply file his name away, because he sees something in Pyrrhus that Pyrrhus himself refuses to see. A man who cannot stop climbing, even when the summit stops meaning anything. Pyrrhus builds his military during this period with the same restless energy he brings to everything else, assembling one of the most formidable fighting forces in the Greek world, veteran infantry drilled in the Macedonian phalanx style, cavalry recruited from across his territories, and eventually, war elephants, exotic and terrifying beasts acquired through his connections with the successor kingdoms. Further east, animals that had once trampled through Alexander's own campaigns in India and now stand enormous and swaying in Epirot stables, waiting for a war worthy of them. And so Pyrrhus sits on his throne, secure but unsatisfied, surrounded by an army built for conquest, with no conquest yet to justify it, endlessly comparing himself to a dead man who reshaped the world before dying young and unfulfilled. He does not know it yet, but he will not have to wait much longer. Because far to the west, across the Adriatic Sea, on the boot-shaped peninsula of Italy, a group of Greek colonists in a wealthy trading city are about to find themselves in a war they cannot win alone, against an enemy most of the Greek world has barely bothered to notice, a stubborn, disciplined, endlessly expanding power, calling itself Rome. And when those colonists start looking desperately for a champion, there is only one name in the entire Mediterranean that fits both their needs and Pyrrhus's own unquenchable appetite for glory. The city is called Tarentum, and on the evening this story properly begins. For it, the harbour is doing what it always does. At dusk, torches catching along the waterline, the smell of salt and pitch and grilled fish drifting between merchant stalls, wealthy Tarentines strolling the colonnades in fine, dyed wool, utterly convinced of their own city's importance. And you have to understand something about Tarentum before anything else. This is not some scrappy frontier outpost. This is the richest, most magnificent Greek city in all of southern Italy, a region so thick with Greek colonies, the Romans themselves call it Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Tarentum has theatres, a famous school of philosophy, a fleet powerful enough to police its own waters, and citizens who genuinely believe their wealth and culture place them above the messy, unglamorous business of actual warfare. That belief is about to be tested very badly. The trouble starts as trouble so often does, with a treaty nobody quite remembers agreeing to and everybody insists the other side violated. Rome and Tarentum have an old arrangement forbidding Roman warships from sailing past a certain point into the Gulf of Tarentum's waters. One afternoon, a small Roman naval squadron, 10 ships, on some errand that historians still debate the purpose of, sails straight past that boundary and into the harbour itself. Whether this is a genuine mistake, a deliberate provocation, or simple Roman indifference to a treaty they never took seriously in the first place, nobody can say for certain even now. What happens next, though, is not in dispute. The Tarentines drunk quite literally, according to several ancient accounts, having caught the fleet's arrival during a wine festival, stormed down to their own ships in outraged fury and attack. Roman ships are sunk. Roman sailors are killed. And just like that, a treaty violation nobody can fully explain has spilled actual blood, and there is no taking it back. Rome predictably does not let this slide. An embassy is dispatched to Tarentum demanding restitution and apology, compensation for the dead. And here is where the Tarentines make the kind of catastrophic misjudgment that entire civilizations sometimes make when they have grown too comfortable behind their own reputation rather than negotiate. Rather than take seriously a power that has spent the better part of a century steadily absorbing every other people on the Italian peninsula, the Tarentine assembly humiliates the Roman envoy in public. Ancient sources describe jeers, mockery of his accented Greek, and in the version that has survived most vividly through the centuries, someone in the crowd defiling his toga, an act of calculated, theatrical insult meant to send the ambassador home in disgrace. The Roman envoy, so the story goes, does not shout back or draw a weapon. He simply looks at the toga, looks at the laughing crowd around him, and delivers a line that the more sober-minded Tarentines in that assembly should have taken as the most frightening thing anyone said to them all year, that they would wash out this stain with a great deal of blood. It sounds almost too perfect, too neatly foreshadowing to be entirely true. Historians still argue over how much of this exchange was polished up after the fact by writers who already knew how the war would end. But whether every detail is accurate or not, the essential truth holds. Tarentum has just insulted in the most public and humiliating way imaginable a power that does not forgive insults and does not lose wars it decides to fight seriously. Rome declares war, and here is the reality check. The Tarentines are only now beginning to grasp the one you probably already sense. Coming for all their wealth, all their culture, all their gleaming temples and philosophical schools, Tarentum has almost no serious army of its own. This is a city built on trade and luxury, not soldiers. Its citizens are merchants and craftsmen, not the kind of hardened, disciplined infantry Rome can field by the tens of thousands from its network of loyal allied towns across central Italy. The Tarentines have picked a fight with the wrong neighbour, and they know it almost immediately, panic spreading through the same colonnades where weeks earlier they had laughed at a foreign ambassador's ruined clothes. So the Tarentine assembly does what wealthy cities with weak armies have always done throughout history: they go shopping for someone else's soldiers. And there is really only one candidate who makes sense, not just because of proximity across the narrow Adriatic Sea, but because of exactly the reputation we spent the last section building: Pyrrhus of Epirus. A king with royal blood tracing back to Achilles, and through Alexander, a living legend in his own right. A commander whose battlefield brilliance is already spoken of in the same breath as the greatest generals of the age. A man, crucially, who has just spent years assembling one of the most formidable professional armies in the entire Greek world, complete with war elephants, and precisely nothing worthy of that army to actually fight. Envoys are dispatched across the sea to Epirus, carrying with them not just a plea for military help, but an offer calculated to appeal to exactly the ambition we have watched. Building in Pyrrhus for 2 full sections, now come to Italy, they tell him defend Greek freedom against the barbarian encroachment of Rome, and in return, help us build something far larger than a defensive alliance, a genuine Western empire stretching from Sicily to the Italian mainland, with Pyrrhus himself at its head. It is an intoxicating pitch, wrapped in the noble language of protecting fellow Greeks. But underneath that noble language sits the real appeal, the one Pyrrhus cannot resist: a chance, finally, to step out from Epirus's cramped mountains and onto a stage vast enough to match the destiny he has spent his entire life believing belongs to him. His advisor Cineas, ever the voice of caution, tries gently to talk him out of it, or at least to make him think through what he actually wants, before committing an army across the sea to a war against a power nobody in the Greek world has. bothered to properly study. Pyrrhus does not listen, not really, though we will return to that conversation between them in vivid detail soon enough, because it may be the single most revealing exchange in this entire story. For now, the decision is already made in Pyrrhus's heart the moment the Tarentine envoys finish speaking. The elephants are getting loaded onto ships. The greatest gamble of his life is about to begin. The port at Epirus, in the weeks before departure, looks less like a military staging ground and more like something out of myth made suddenly chaotically real. And here is what you have to understand about the scale of what Pyrrhus is attempting. No Greek king from the mainland has ever tried to transport an army of this size across open water, complete with animals most of his own sailors have never even seen up close before this campaign. The numbers vary somewhat depending on which ancient source you trust, but the core of the force runs to roughly 20,000 infantry, several thousand cavalry, a few thousand archers and slingers. And the single detail that will come to define this entire campaign in the popular imagination for the next 2,000 years. 20 war elephants, enormous grey shapes swaying at anchor points near the docks, tended by handlers who have trained with them for years, and who now face the considerably harder task of getting them safely across a stretch of open sea, notorious for sudden, violent storms. Before any of this can happen, though, there is the conversation with Cineas, and it deserves to be told properly because it is one of those rare moments in ancient history where a private exchange between two men gets preserved almost intact, and it tells you more about Pyrrhus's character than any battle report ever could. Cineas, watching the preparations, the ships being loaded, the sheer scale of ambition on display, asks his king a simple question. What does he intend to do once he has conquered Italy? Pyrrhus answers easily. Sicily lies right next door, ripe and wealthy, and surely that would come next. And after Sicily, Cineas presses what then Pyrrhus, warming to the fantasy, now describes moving on from there to Carthage and Libya across the sea, subduing that great trading power as well. And after that, Pyrrhus laughs and says that after all of that, he supposes he and Cineas could finally rest, drink wine together, and enjoy easy, pleasant conversation for the remainder of their days. And Cineas gently, devastatingly points out that nothing is stopping them from doing exactly that right now tonight, without losing a single soldier or crossing a single sea. It is a quietly brutal piece of logic, and Pyrrhus has no real answer for it beyond an awkward smile, because Cineas has just exposed the hollow center of the entire enterprise, a man chasing a horizon that will always recede exactly as fast. As he approaches it, a conquest that promises rest at its end, but structurally can never actually deliver rest, because there is always another kingdom past the next one. Ancient writers who record this exchange clearly intend it as tragic foreshadowing, and it is worth remembering as this story unfolds across the sections ahead, because Pyrrhus never actually forgets this conversation. He simply chooses again and again not to let it change anything. The crossing itself very nearly ends the entire expedition before it properly begins. A sudden autumn storm scatters Pyrrhus's fleet across the open water, and his own flagship is driven badly off course. Its steering equipment damaged its sail, torn apart in gusts, strong enough to tear canvas like paper. Ancient accounts describe Pyrrhus in the worst of it, leaping from his flagship into a smaller boat in a desperate bid to reach shore before the larger vessel is completely lost, swimming part of the final distance himself. When even the smaller boat proves unable to make safe landfall, he survives, dragged onto an Italian beach, exhausted, half-drowned, and stripped of most of the grand fleet he set out with. Some transports carrying his cavalry are blown wildly off course and take days to regroup. Worse, several of the ships carrying his precious elephants are separated entirely. And for some agonizing stretch of time, Pyrrhus has no idea whether the animals his entire tactical plan depends on have survived the crossing at all, or are lying drowned somewhere at the bottom of the Adriatic. They have not drowned, as it turns out, though it takes days of anxious searching along the coastline before the elephant transports are located and safely brought ashore, the great animals reportedly having endured the storm by simply standing still and enduring, according to their handlers, with the same stoic patience they will later show on far bloodier ground. It is a strange, almost darkly comic detail worth sitting with for a moment. That the animals meant to terrify grown men into panic on a battlefield spent their worst night at sea, simply waiting quietly for the weather to pass, while the humans around them nearly fell apart. Pyrrhus makes landfall in Italy with a fraction of the force he set out, with soaked, exhausted, and having already lost men, horses, and equipment before a single Roman soldier has come anywhere near him. And here is the reality check worth sitting with, the one that should have given even a man as confident as Pyrrhus real pause. He has arrived to fight the most disciplined military machine in the Mediterranean world, an enemy that can replace losses from a seemingly bottomless pool of Italian allies, and he has arrived weakened before the campaign has even started. Tarentum, for its part, is not much help either. The wealthy citizens who begged him to come are reportedly far more interested in continuing their comfortable lives than in actually fighting. And Pyrrhus, in one of the more startling moves of his career, essentially has to impose martial law on the very city that invited him, closing theatres and gymnasiums, conscripting Tarentine men into his ranks, whether they volunteer or not, because he has quickly realized that if he waits for Tarentum to organize a real war effort on its own, he will be waiting forever. Slowly, though, the army reassembles. The elephants are marched inland, drawing crowds of astonished, half-terrified Italian onlookers who have genuinely never seen such creatures before. Word spreads ahead of Pyrrhus's advance, carried by frightened locals and Roman scouts alike, of grey mountains that walk and trumpet like nothing on earth. And somewhere to the north, Roman commanders are receiving that same word, weighing whether to wait for Pyrrhus to come to them or to march out and meet this strange invading king before he can gather his full strength. They choose to march. And so, on a stretch of ground near a town called Heraclea, two armies that have never faced each other before, representing two entirely different worlds of warfare, are about to collide for the very first time. The plain outside Heraclea, on the morning this story reaches its first true test, is wrapped in a low mist, rolling off the nearby river Siris, the kind of grey, damp cold that gets into wool cloaks and iron armour alike and makes soldiers on. Both sides shift their weight and mutter prayers under their breath. On one side of that river stand the Romans arranged in their maniples small, flexible units of roughly 120 men each, a formation entirely unlike anything Pyrrhus has faced in his years of fighting fellow Greeks and Macedonians. On the other side stands Pyrrhus's own army, the Macedonian-style phalanx at its core, long sarissa spears bristling forward in a wall that has crushed armies from Greece to India, cavalry on the flanks and behind it all waiting. The elephants. Here is what you have to understand about this moment and why it matters so much beyond the immediate battle. Neither side has ever fought the other before. The Romans have heard rumours of Greek phalanxes but never stood against one in real combat. Pyrrhus has commanded armies across half the Mediterranean but never once faced Roman infantry, never seen firsthand how a legion actually moves, adapts and absorbs punishment. This is in the truest sense a first contact between two entirely different military traditions, and both commanders know that whatever happens on this field will shape everything that follows. Pyrrhus, ever the tactician, initially considers waiting for reinforcements before engaging, but when he sees the Romans beginning to ford the river, he recognizes an opportunity too good to pass up, catching part of their army, mid-crossing, vulnerable and divided by the water. He sends his cavalry forward first, testing the Roman line, and the fighting that follows is fierce and inconclusive. Cavalry wheeling and clashing along the riverbank, while infantry on both sides begin edging into range. And here is where the battle takes its first genuinely brutal turn. Pyrrhus leading from the front as he always does throughout his life, a habit both admirable and we will see ultimately reckless, finds himself in the thick of close combat, and at some point, in the chaos, loses his own horse and very nearly his own life, saved only when he trades armour with one of his officers, a man named Megacles, in a desperate bid to draw enemy attention away from the actual king. The trick very nearly backfires in the worst possible way. A Roman soldier, believing he has found and killed Pyrrhus himself, cuts down Megacles and holds his captured helmet aloft in triumph, and for a stretch of agonizing minutes, word spreads through both armies that the enemy king is dead. Roman morale surge. Pyrrhus's own soldiers, believing their king has fallen, begin to waver, some units on the verge of breaking entirely. And here is what you have to understand about Pyrrhus as a battlefield commander, the quality that separates him from so many other capable generals of his era. Rather than staying safely back to manage the crisis from a distance, he rides, bareheaded through his own collapsing lines, showing his face to every soldier who can see him, proving with his own body that the rumor is false. It is an act of tremendous physical courage and considerable theatrical instinct in equal measure, and it works. His army steadies reforms and pushes forward with renewed confidence exactly when it might otherwise have shattered. The infantry lines finally meet in full, and for a long, grinding stretch of the afternoon, the battle hangs in genuine, terrible balance. Ancient accounts describe the fighting surging back and forth, 7 separate times, neither phalanx nor legion able to fully break the other casualties, mounting on both sides in that horrible, patient way that close-order ancient combat produces. Not the quick, decisive strokes of storybook battles, but hours of exhausting, grinding attrition, men pushing against shields, spears, finding gaps in armor, the ground beneath them, growing slick and treacherous. It is Roman discipline against Epirot skill, and for hours nobody can say which will win. Then Pyrrhus makes the decision that turns the entire battle and turns out to matter for the entire war beyond it. He commits the elephants. And you have to try to imagine this from the Roman perspective, because these are men who have never in their lives seen such a creature, let alone watched one advance toward them on a battlefield, trumpeting enormous, seemingly unstoppable, with archers and spearmen mounted in wooden towers, strapped to their backs, raining missiles down from a height no Roman soldier has ever had to defend against. The Roman cavalry horses, never having encountered the scent or sight of elephants before, panic, completely rearing and bolting in every direction, throwing the entire Roman cavalry wing into chaos before a single elephant has even reached the main infantry line. The infantry itself begins to waver as the great animals press forward, and what had been a grinding, evenly matched battle abruptly tips into a rout. The Roman army breaks and flees toward their camp, Pyrrhus's cavalry and elephants pursuing, and by the time the fighting finally ends, the field belongs unmistakably to Pyrrhus. It is by any conventional measure a resounding victory, the first time a Roman army has been defeated in open battle by a foreign king. A genuine shock to a power that has spent the better part of a century steadily grinding down every rival on the Italian peninsula. Word of the defeat spreads north to Rome itself, and for the first time, the Senate has to seriously reckon with the possibility that this strange Epirot king and his impossible grey beasts might actually be capable of doing what no other enemy has managed, breaking Rome's long, patient march toward dominance. But victory, as Pyrrhus is about to discover in the grimmest possible way, is not the same thing as winning. Because as the sun sets over the field at Heraclea and his officers begin the slow, exhausting work of counting the dead, Pyrrhus rides among his own lines, surveying the cost of what he has just achieved, and what he sees there will haunt every decision he makes for the rest of this campaign. The morning after Heraclea brings none of the celebration a victory of this size should carry. Instead, Pyrrhus walks the field in the pale, early light, stepping between rows of the dead being gathered for burial. And here is what you have to understand about what he is actually looking at. These are not the anonymous Tarentine conscripts he pressed into service back at the coast, men whose loss would sting but not truly wound him. These are his own veterans, the hardened core of professional soldiers he brought with him from Epirus, men who had fought beside him for years, officers he knew by name, phalangites who had survived campaigns across Greece and Macedon only to fall here on foreign soil in a war that was never truly theirs to begin with. The Roman dead number heavily too, by most ancient accounts, even more heavily than his own. But that arithmetic offers Pyrrhus little comfort, because Rome, as he is only now beginning to fully grasp, can replace its losses in a way that he simply cannot. This is the moment historians point to when they trace the origin of the phrase that will attach itself to Pyrrhus's name for the rest of recorded history, though the exact wording, as with so much from this era, comes down to us slightly differently depending on which ancient source you trust. Surveying the field, or perhaps responding to a courtier offering congratulations on the victory, Pyrrhus is said to have remarked with grim, weary honesty that if he won one more battle against the Romans at this cost, he would be finished entirely ruined by his own success. It is a line that will not fully crystallize into its most famous form until later in this story we will return to it properly at Asculum, where the phrase Pyrrhic victory truly earns its permanent place in the language. But the sentiment behind it is already fully formed here at Heraclea, in this quiet, grim morning among the dead. And here is what you have to understand about why this loss cuts so differently than losses might for Rome. Pyrrhus's army is by its very nature an expedition, a finite force carried across the sea with no easy pipeline of replacements behind it. Every phalangite who falls here is not simply a number subtracted from a roster. He is a piece of irreplaceable expertise, years of training and discipline that cannot be conjured back into existence by conscripting some fresh Tarentine farmer and handing him a spear. Macedonian-style phalanx warfare, the kind that has dominated Greek battlefields for generations, depends on cohesion built through years of drilling together. Soldiers who know instinctively how to hold formation shoulder to shoulder, how to advance and wheel as a single organism rather than a collection of individuals. You cannot manufacture that overnight, and Pyrrhus does not have the luxury of years to rebuild what he has just spent in a single afternoon. Rome, by grim contrast, operates on an entirely different logic of warfare, one that Pyrrhus is only beginning to comprehend and will spend the rest of this campaign failing to fully counter. The Roman state does not rely on a single, irreplaceable professional corps the way Pyrrhus does. It draws instead on a vast network of allied Italian towns and peoples bound to Rome through a web of treaties, each one obligated to supply soldiers when Rome calls. It is a strange, and from a Greek perspective, almost unsettling model of state power, less reliant on individual battlefield brilliance and more on sheer patient institutional depth, the ability to absorb catastrophic losses and simply keep coming. Pyrrhus, trained in a world where a single decisive battle could end a war outright, is about to learn that Rome does not play by those rules at all. There is a darker undercurrent to this section worth sitting with too, a lesser-known detail that rarely makes it into the popular retelling of this campaign. Among the Roman dead and wounded at Heraclea is a Roman consul and Pyrrhus, ever attentive to the psychological theatre of war as much as its physical mechanics. Reportedly takes the time afterward to walk among the fallen on both sides and study the Roman bodies, specifically their wounds, their equipment, the disciplined way. Even the dead had fallen, still holding formation lines, rather than scattered in panic. Ancient writers claim, he remarked, studying this grim evidence that had he commanded soldiers like these, or had these men been fighting for him, he might have conquered the entire world already. It is meant in the sources as a kind of backhanded compliment to Roman discipline. But read now with the benefit of knowing how this story ends. It carries a heavier weight. The sound of a man beginning, however dimly, to sense that he has picked a fight with something fundamentally different from every enemy he has beaten before. And here is the moment of dry, weary humour, amid all this heaviness, because even ancient historians writing centuries later could not resist noting the irony. Pyrrhus has just won, technically, decisively, undeniably won, and the mood in his camp resembles nothing so much as a funeral. His officers move through the aftermath in grim silence rather than celebration. Somewhere in Tarentum, wealthy citizens who begged him to come and fight this war are presumably still enjoying their theatres and gymnasiums, blissfully insulated from the cost being paid on their behalf. It is the kind of bitter joke that only makes sense in hindsight, the sort of thing a storyteller centuries later can shake his head over, even while admiring the sheer scale of what Pyrrhus achieved on that field. Word of the defeat reaches Rome, and the response from the Senate is not what Pyrrhus or anyone watching from the Greek world might have expected. Rather than suing for peace immediately, rather than treating this loss as the beginning of the end, Rome begins raising fresh legions almost at once, preparing to keep fighting exactly as though Heraclea had never happened. But before that renewed war can begin, in earnest, there is one more attempt at a different path forward, a diplomatic gambit sent by Pyrrhus himself in the hope that perhaps this costly grinding war might still be avoided. He sends his most trusted advisor, the same sharp-tongued Cineas who once talked him in circles about the futility of endless conquest to Rome itself, carrying an offer of peace into the very heart of the enemy's power. What happens in that Roman Senate chamber is about to become one of the most quietly devastating scenes in this entire story. Cineas arrives in Rome not as a conqueror's herald, but as something far more dangerous to Roman resolve, a genuinely brilliant diplomat trained in the same rhetorical traditions that produced the greatest orators of the Greek world, carrying with him not just Pyrrhus's peace terms, but an entire arsenal of charm, flattery, and carefully distributed gifts meant to soften Roman resistance before a single formal word of negotiation is even spoken. And here is what you have to understand about how seriously Pyrrhus takes this mission. He does not send a lesser envoy to handle what he considers a formality. He sends the single most persuasive man in his court because Pyrrhus genuinely believes, after Heraclea, that Rome can be talked out of this war entirely, that the shock of defeat, combined with the right diplomatic pressure, might accomplish what his elephants alone could not, an end to the fighting on terms favourable to him without the further, staggering cost that a full march on Rome itself would require. Cineas's terms, once formally presented to the Senate, are not unreasonable by the standards of the era: recognition of Tarentum's independence, the return of Roman prisoners, protection for the various Greek cities of southern Italy, and peace between Rome and Epirus going forward. He backs this diplomatic pitch with an old practiced technique, moving through the city in the days before the formal session, greeting senators individually, distributing gifts, learning names and family details, doing the quiet, patient work of building goodwill one relationship at a time. Ancient writers describe him as remarkably effective at this, so much so that he reportedly tells Pyrrhus afterward, with a note of genuine unease, that Rome does not feel to him like the disorganized barbarian assembly the Greek world assumes it to be, but something closer to what he calls a senate of kings, a body of men carrying themselves with a gravity and unified purpose that Cineas, who has seen the courts of half the Mediterranean, finds almost unsettling in its discipline. And for a moment, remarkably, it seems to be working. The Senate, weighing the cost of continued war against an enemy who has already proven he can defeat their legions in open battle, begins leaning toward accepting the peace terms, weary senators calculating that further fighting might cost more than it could possibly gain. This is the moment where the entire war might have ended quietly, with a treaty, rather than years more bloodshed, and it is worth pausing on that, because so much of what follows in this story, all the further battles and losses still ahead of us, might simply never have happened at all, if not for what happens next. Into the Senate chamber, at this delicate, wavering moment, comes an old man, blind, elderly, carried in on a litter by his own sons, because he can no longer walk unassisted or see the faces of the men he is about to address. This is Appius Claudius Caecus, a former censor and consul, a man whose public career had ended years earlier, who by this point in his life has largely withdrawn from active politics, entirely content to let younger senators handle the state's business. But word reaches him of the Senate's wavering mood, of the very real possibility that Rome might accept peace with a foreign king who has just humiliated their army on Italian soil. And something in that possibility drags the old man out of retirement one final time. And here is the scene worth picturing vividly, because it is genuinely one of the great moments of ancient political theatre. This blind old statesman, carried into the chamber by his sons, rises to speak and delivers a speech that ancient historians preserved, at least in fragments and paraphrase, for centuries afterward as a model of stern Roman resolve. He tells the assembled senators, in essence, that he had long wished never to see the day when his eyesight failed him, but that, hearing of their willingness to negotiate with Pyrrhus, he now wishes he had lost his hearing as well. He reminds them that Rome has never, in all its history, bowed to a foreign king, simply because that king had won a single battle, and that accepting peace now under these circumstances would mean surrendering not just territory, but Rome's entire hard-won reputation, inviting every other power in the Mediterranean to conclude that Roman resolve breaks the moment it suffers a real setback. Let Pyrrhus, he tells them, withdraw from Italy first, return home across the sea he came from. and then Rome might discuss terms as one power to another, but never while a foreign army still stands on Italian soil, dictating conditions from a position of apparent strength. The effect is immediate and total. Whatever momentum toward peace had been building in the chamber collapses under the weight of the old man's fury, and the Senate votes decisively now to reject Pyrrhus's terms and continue the war. Cineas, watching this reversal unfold, understands with a diplomat's clear-eyed precision exactly what he is witnessing, and it unsettles him more than any battlefield defeat could have. He returns to Pyrrhus not with a treaty, but with something arguably more valuable and more frightening, a genuine first-hand assessment of the enemy they are actually fighting. The report Cineas delivers back to his king carries the weight of real dread beneath its measured diplomatic language. He tells Pyrrhus that Rome is no ordinary kingdom to be cowed by a single defeat, that its Senate resembles an assembly of monarchs, rather than the fractious council of merchants and nobles Pyrrhus might have expected, and that behind this one army, already beaten at Heraclea, stands a seemingly endless capacity to raise more, that for every legion destroyed Rome appears able to summon another from the deep well of allied towns and peoples bound to it, across the Italian peninsula. And here is the dry, bitter humour buried inside this otherwise grim report, the kind of observation only a truly gifted rhetorician could deliver with a straight face. Cineas reportedly notes that it seems as though Rome has a spring of soldiers that refuses to run dry, a hydra's worth of legions, so that defeating one merely clears the way for the next. Pyrrhus listens to all of this, weighs it against the vast army still under his own command, the momentum of a genuine victory already won, and the pride of a man who has never in his life backed away from a fight once it has been offered to him, and decides against every warning his own most trusted advisor has just handed him to. Press forward anyway. The road that leads Pyrrhus back into battle against Rome takes nearly 2 full years to arrive, and those years are not idle ones. Both sides spend the interval doing exactly what their respective systems allow them to do best. Rome rebuilds, raising fresh legions from its deep well of allied manpower, absorbing the shock of Heraclea, and refusing, true to Appius Claudius's fierce speech, to let a single defeat alter its long-term resolve. Pyrrhus, meanwhile, faces the far harder task of replacing what cannot truly be replaced: veteran phalangites, trained officers, the irreplaceable cohesion of a professional core army that took years to build in the first place. He scrapes together reinforcements where he can, drawing on Tarentum and the other Greek cities of southern Italy, supplementing his depleted ranks with allies whose loyalty is considerably less certain and whose training is nowhere near the standard of the men he lost. By the time the two armies meet again near a town called Asculum in the region of Apulia, the terrain itself tells you almost everything about how differently each side wants this battle to unfold. The ground is broken, wooded, cut through with a river, and marshy patches unsuited to cavalry maneuvers or the wide-open formations that let Pyrrhus's elephants operate at their most devastating. And here is what you have to understand about why this matters so enormously. The Romans, having now fought Pyrrhus once already and paid dearly for the lesson, have spent the intervening months studying exactly what went wrong at Heraclea, and they have arrived at Asculum with a battle plan, specifically designed to neutralize the two advantages that broke them the first time: the terrifying, unfamiliar elephants and the long reach of the Macedonian phalanx's sarissa spears. On the first day of fighting, the Roman strategy becomes immediately apparent. Rather than meeting Pyrrhus on open, favourable ground, Roman commanders deliberately draw the fighting into the broken wooded terrain near the riverbank, where Pyrrhus's phalanx cannot maintain the tight, disciplined formation that makes it so devastating in open field, and where his cavalry and elephants struggle to find room to manoeuvre effectively. The fighting on this first day is brutal, close, and largely inconclusive, both sides absorbing heavy losses in terrain that favours neither one decisively. Roman maniples proving frustratingly flexible in the broken ground, able to split apart, and reform in ways the rigid phalanx formation simply cannot match. By nightfall, exhausted and bloodied, both armies withdraw to their camps, having gained essentially nothing for the day's suffering. The second day tells a very different story, and it is worth picturing vividly because this is where Pyrrhus's tactical brilliance finally reasserts itself in full. Overnight, he moves his forces onto ground of his own, choosing flatter and more open terrain that finally allows his phalanx to form its full, terrifying wall of spears and gives his elephants the room they need to charge effectively. The Romans, forced now to fight on Pyrrhus's terms rather than their own, come prepared, this time with a countermeasure, specifically designed against the elephants, wagons fitted with long spikes, fire pots, and other improvised devices meant to wound and panic the great animals before they can reach the Roman line. It is a clever, desperate innovation born entirely out of the trauma of Heraclea, and for a while, it actually works, several elephants wounded and driven into confused retreat by the burning pots and spiked contraptions. But cleverness alone cannot fully overcome the sheer weight and terror the elephants bring to a battlefield, still largely unfamiliar with them, and once enough of the animals push past the Roman countermeasures and into the actual infantry, lines the same devastating panic that broke the Roman cavalry at Heraclea repeats itself here, horses bolting, formations buckling under the combined pressure of elephant charges and the advancing phalanx behind them. By the close of the second day, the Roman army breaks and withdraws to its camp, and the field once again technically belongs to Pyrrhus. And here is where this battle earns its permanent place in the language, the moment this entire story has been quietly building toward since that grim morning after Heraclea. As Pyrrhus surveys the field afterward, the casualties staggering on both sides, his own losses once again falling disproportionately among his irreplaceable veteran corps. More trusted officers and battle-hardened phalangites dead in the mud of Apulia. A courtier or officer approaches, offering the customary congratulations due a victorious king. And Pyrrhus, according to the account preserved by the ancient historian Plutarch, delivers the line that will outlive every battle he ever fought, every kingdom he ever ruled, every ambition he ever chased. That one more victory like this one and he will be utterly ruined. It is worth sitting with the weight of that sentence for a moment, because it captures something almost unbearably clear-eyed about the trap Pyrrhus has built for himself. He has, by every conventional measure of ancient warfare, defeated the Roman army in the field for a second time, and yet he understands with a bitter, exhausted clarity that his own earlier ambition never allowed him to fully anticipate that this kind of victory is functionally indistinguishable from defeat, that Rome can absorb these losses and rebuild while he cannot, that every field he wins on Italian soil drains him a little closer to having nothing left to win with at all. Historians still argue over the exact wording Plutarch preserved, whether Pyrrhus's original words were quite this crisp and quotable, or polished up by later writers who already knew how perfectly this phrase would echo through the centuries. But the sentiment is unmistakably tragically his. And here is the small, dry irony worth pausing on before we move forward. The kind of thing that would earn a rueful laugh around any campfire retelling this story. The phrase Pyrrhic victory will go on to outlive the man who coined it by well over 2,000 years, used by historians and journalists. And ordinary people who have never heard of Heraclea or Asculum or Tarentum to describe any triumph that costs more than it is worth. Pyrrhus set out from Epirus, dreaming of matching Alexander's eternal glory. What he actually achieves in the end is a phrase, a permanent linguistic monument not to conquest, but to the exact moment ambition outran sense. And with his army bled dangerously thin, his veteran corps badly depleted, and Rome showing no sign whatsoever of suing for peace, Pyrrhus now faces an uncomfortable question that will define the next phase of this entire campaign. Whether Italy, this brutal, grinding, endlessly costly war, is even a fight worth continuing to fight at all. The uncomfortable question hanging over Pyrrhus after Asculum does not resolve itself through careful strategic reflection so much as it gets answered for him, arriving in the form of envoys crossing the sea from an entirely different direction, carrying an offer almost perfectly engineered to appeal to a restless man already wondering whether Italy has become a trap he cannot afford to keep fighting his way out of. The island of Sicily, close enough to see from parts of southern Italy on a clear day, has spent generations locked in its own brutal, exhausting struggle. Greek cities on the island's eastern and southern coasts, fighting for survival against the expanding power of Carthage. The great Phoenician trading empire, based across the water in North Africa, whose wealth, naval power, dwarf almost anything the fractious Sicilian Greeks can muster on their own. And here is what you have to understand about why this particular invitation lands with such force on a man in Pyrrhus's exact position. Sicily offers him almost everything Italy has failed to provide. Where Rome seemed to possess an inexhaustible well of soldiers, no matter how many legions Pyrrhus defeated, Carthage, while wealthy and powerful at sea, relies heavily on mercenary armies, rather than the deep loyal network of allied manpower that keeps refilling Roman ranks. Where the war in Italy has become a grinding, costly stalemate, despite 2 field victories, the Sicilian Greeks are practically begging for rescue, offering not just military support, but the kind of enthusiastic welcome Tarentum promised, and then spectacularly failed to deliver. And perhaps most seductively of all, Sicily represents exactly the next rung on the ladder Pyrrhus described so casually to Cineas back before this entire expedition began. Conquer Italy, then Sicily, then perhaps Carthage itself. Here, arriving almost precisely on schedule, is that very next step, dressed up as desperate necessity rather than naked ambition. The Sicilian city of Syracuse, the largest and most powerful Greek settlement on the island, sends the most urgent pleas its own royal line, having recently died out and left the city vulnerable, its citizens terrified that Carthage is on the verge of finally swallowing the last significant Greek stronghold on the island entirely. They offer Pyrrhus not merely military support but genuine political authority if he comes to their aid. A chance to rule as something close to a king across a significant portion of Sicily rather than simply serving as a hired general. And there is one further quietly poignant thread pulling at Pyrrhus in this decision, one that ancient sources note, without dwelling on excessively. His wife Lanassa, one of several wives across his complicated marital history, is herself the daughter of the ruler of Syracuse, giving Pyrrhus a genuine dynastic claim to involvement in Sicilian affairs beyond simple opportunism. Pyrrhus weighs this offer against the grim mathematics he has been forced to confront since that bitter morning after Asculum. His army, though still formidable, has been bled dangerously thin by 2 costly victories. Rome shows absolutely no sign of exhaustion, continuing to raise fresh legions with the same maddening, inexhaustible patience that so unsettled Cineas during his embassy. Tarentum and the other Italian Greek cities that begged Pyrrhus to come and save them have proven in practice disappointingly unenthusiastic about actually fighting for their own freedom, content to let his diminishing veteran corps absorb casualties on their behalf while they continue much the same comfortable lives that provoked this entire war in the first place. Sicily, by contrast, glitters with the promise of an easier, more decisive campaign against an enemy that fights differently than Rome, backed by allies who seem, at least for now, genuinely desperate for his help, rather than merely tolerant of his presence. And here is a moment worth pausing on for its dry, uncomfortable humor, the kind of detail ancient historians could not resist, including even while documenting a genuinely difficult strategic decision. Pyrrhus reportedly makes his choice to sail for Sicily so abruptly and executes the shift with such visible relief that it does little to disguise from his own allies exactly how tired he has already grown of Italy's endless grinding cost. The Tarentines, watching their supposed saviour pack up and sail off toward a shinier opportunity barely 2 years into a war he promised to win on their behalf, are left with the distinctly uncomfortable sensation of having been, in the most literal sense, a stepping stone rather than a genuine cause. Pyrrhus crosses to Sicily in the spring, leaving behind a garrison in Tarentum and a promise sincere enough in the moment, even if history will prove it hollow, that he intends to return once Sicily's crisis has been resolved. And here is what you have to understand about how differently this new campaign begins compared to the brutal opening chapters of the Italian War. Sicily receives him not as a foreign invader forcing his way onto unwilling territory, but genuinely enthusiastically as a liberator. City after city along the Sicilian coast opens its gates to him without a fight, Greek populations exhausted by generations of Carthaginian pressure practically flooding into his camp with offers of alliance and support. It is for a brief, intoxicating stretch. Everything Italy failed to be a campaign that feels less like grinding attrition and more like the kind of triumphant, welcomed conquest Pyrrhus always imagined for himself, the kind Alexander himself might have recognized. Carthaginian forces, caught off guard by the scale and speed of this sudden Greek unification under a single capable commander, begin withdrawing from several of their previously secure positions rather than risk facing Pyrrhus's veteran army in open battle. Within a remarkably short span of time, Pyrrhus finds himself hailed not merely as a hired general, but as something closer to a genuine king of Sicily, his authority extending across a significant portion of the island, his reputation soaring on a wave of momentum that Italy, for all its costly victories, never quite managed to produce. It feels, for this brief golden window, like Pyrrhus has finally found the campaign worthy of his ambition. But there is one Carthaginian stronghold left standing that will test this newfound momentum in the most literal, dramatic way imaginable. A mighty fortress perched on a cliff called Eryx, considered by many to be nearly impregnable, and Pyrrhus, never a man to leave a difficult challenge unanswered, is about to attempt something that will either cement his legend permanently or get him killed trying. The fortress of Eryx sits high on a steep mountain overlooking the western coast of Sicily, its walls following the natural contours of the cliff face so closely that from a distance it looks less like something built by human hands and more like an extension of the rock itself, ancient even by the standards of this already ancient world, sacred to a temple of Venus that has drawn pilgrims and worshippers for generations before Pyrrhus ever set foot on the island. And here is what you have to understand about why this particular stronghold matters so enormously to the entire Sicilian campaign. Eryx is not simply one more Carthaginian outpost among many. It is considered by virtually every military mind of the era nearly unconquerable, a position so naturally defensible that previous attempts to take it by force have ended in humiliating failure, and its continued Carthaginian garrison stands as a permanent, visible reminder to every Sicilian Greek watching Pyrrhus's campaign that Carthage has not actually been driven from the island at all, merely inconvenienced. Pyrrhus arrives beneath those walls, understanding perfectly well what capturing this fortress would mean not just tactically but symbolically for a campaign that has so far been built on momentum and reputation as much as raw military force. And here is where his character reveals itself in a way that differs sharply from the grinding, exhausting attrition warfare of Italy. Pyrrhus does not settle in for a long, patient siege, starving the garrison out over months or years the way a more cautious commander might. Instead, according to Plutarch's vivid account, he decides to lead the assault on the walls himself, personally at the very front of the attacking force, in a display of physical courage that borders on theatrical recklessness, even by the standards of a man who has already made a career out of leading from the front. Picture the scene properly, because it deserves to be pictured properly. Pyrrhus in full armor, climbing, scaling ladders propped against sheer stone walls, under a rain of arrows and missiles from defenders above, close enough to the Tarifae fortress's dedication to Venus that he reportedly makes a vow, beforehand promising games and sacrifices to the goddess if he succeeds in taking her sacred mountain. He reaches the top of the wall ahead of his own soldiers, and what follows is described in terms that sound almost more like myth than military history. Pyrrhus standing alone or nearly alone atop the battlements for a stretch of desperate, chaotic fighting, cutting down defenders who come at him from multiple directions at once, driving Carthaginian and Sicilian mercenary soldiers back off the wall through what ancient sources frame as almost superhuman personal combat prowess, buying just enough time for the rest of his climbing soldiers to reach the top and pour into the fortress behind him. And here is what you have to understand about why this kind of leadership, however reckless it looks from a purely strategic standpoint, matters so much to how Pyrrhus's soldiers regard him. This is not a king who sends other men to die. On walls he is unwilling to climb himself. Time and again throughout this story we have watched Pyrrhus place himself at the absolute center of danger, at Heraclea trading armor, to draw enemy attention here at Eryx, leading the actual scaling assault rather than directing it from safety below. It builds a particular kind of fierce, almost devoted loyalty among the soldiers who follow him, the sense that their king shares every risk he asks them to take. But it also, as this story will eventually make painfully clear, represents a kind of recklessness that eventually catches up with even the most gifted and fortunate of commanders, and we are not finished by any means watching Pyrrhus test that particular luck. The fortress falls. Eryx, considered nearly impregnable, taken not through months of patient siege engineering but through one furious personally led assault, and the psychological effect across Sicily is immediate and enormous. Pyrrhus's reputation, already considerable from the swift welcomed liberation of city after city along the coast, now takes on something closer to genuine legend. Soldiers and Sicilian Greeks alike begin comparing him openly, not merely to a skilled general, but to the great mythic conquerors of the past, and ancient sources describe him at the height of this moment, being hailed with honours. That edge, toward outright divine reverence, crowds gathering simply to see the man who scaled the walls of Venus's sacred mountain and won. There is a quieter, stranger detail worth including here too, the sort of lesser-known texture that rarely survives into the popular telling of this campaign true to his battlefield vow. Pyrrhus follows through afterward with lavish games and sacrifices dedicated to Venus at the captured temple, a gesture that costs him real resources and time in the middle of an active military campaign, but which matters enormously to how his Sicilian allies perceive him, not as a foreign opportunist, simply using their crisis for his own gain, but as a man genuinely willing to honour the sacred customs of the land he has come to defend. It is exactly the kind of gesture that back in the Italian campaign might have won him deeper loyalty from Tarentum had he thought to make it earlier. For a brief shining stretch of time following the fall of Eryx, everything Pyrrhus set out to achieve when he first crossed from Italy seems to be materializing precisely as he hoped. Carthaginian power on the island is badly shaken, reduced now to a handful of remaining coastal strongholds, rather than the sprawling threat it represented when he first arrived. Sicilian Greek cities that once lived in genuine terror of Carthaginian conquest now look to Pyrrhus not merely as a hired liberator, but as something closer to a permanent king. The kind of unifying figure the fractious, perpetually squabbling Sicilian Greeks have lacked for generations. And yet here is the quiet, uneasy note worth sitting with as this section closes, the one that any careful listener should already feel gathering at the edges of this triumphant moment. Pyrrhus has spent his entire life building kingdoms, only to grow restless within them the moment the fighting stops being new, and the very qualities that make him such a devastatingly effective conqueror, the restless energy, the need to be constantly proving himself against the next impossible wall, have never once in this entire story proven capable of sustaining what comes after victory. Sicily is about to discover exactly what that pattern feels like from the inside. The trouble in Sicily begins, as it so often does in this story, not with a battlefield defeat, but with the much quieter, much more corrosive erosion of trust that follows any conqueror who arrives as a saviour and then has to actually govern the people he saved. And here is what you have to understand about the fundamental problem sitting underneath Pyrrhus's dazzling early success on the island. The Sicilian Greek cities that welcomed him so enthusiastically were never a unified people bound by genuine loyalty to him personally. They were a loose collection of fiercely independent city-states, each with its own long history of jealous rivalry against its neighbours, each accustomed to governing its own affairs without interference, and each of them had invited Pyrrhus in for one specific, narrow purpose, driving out the Carthaginian threat, rather than handing him permanent, unquestioned authority over their internal affairs. Pyrrhus, flush with the momentum of Eryx and the string of welcomed liberations that preceded it, begins to behave less like a temporary military champion and more like the actual king he has started to believe himself entitled to be. He installs garrisons in cities that expected him to leave once the immediate danger passed. He begins making demands for money and resources to fund the continuing war against Carthage's remaining strongholds, demands that start to feel to increasingly resentful Sicilian citizens less like reasonable wartime necessity and more like the same kind of imperial extraction they had hoped a Greek liberator would spare them from. And here is the bitter irony worth sitting with, the kind of detail that any careful listener should recognize by now as a pattern running through this entire story. Pyrrhus, the man who came to Sicily promising freedom from foreign domination, begins to look to the very people he liberated disturbingly similar to the foreign power he replaced. Ancient sources describe growing whispers among the Sicilian Greek leadership, quiet conversations in the same cities that had once flooded his camp with enthusiastic offers of alliance, now increasingly suspicious that Pyrrhus intends to remain not as a temporary champion, but as a permanent, unremovable king ruling over cities that had never actually surrendered that kind of authority to him. Some of the island's most prominent citizens, according to Plutarch's account, begin secretly reaching out to Carthage itself, and even to the Mamertines, a group of Italian mercenaries who had seized control of the Sicilian city of Messina and represent yet another destabilizing faction on an island already crowded with competing interests. Weighing whether an uncomfortable accommodation with Pyrrhus's old enemies might now be preferable to living permanently under his rule. Pyrrhus's response to this gathering suspicion does little to help his cause, and a great deal to confirm the very fears driving it. When he uncovers or believes he has uncovered evidence that certain Sicilian nobles are conspiring against him, he moves with the same ruthless decisiveness that once dispatched his rival co-king Neoptolemus back in Epirus, executing or exiling suspected conspirators, actions that may well have been justified given genuine plots against him, but which land in the political climate of an already anxious island as exactly the kind of tyrannical overreach the whispered rumors had predicted. And here is what you have to understand about how quickly goodwill can curdle once fear enters the equation. The same Sicilian Greeks who had greeted him as a liberating hero less than 2 years earlier now begin to regard him with the same wary suspicion they once reserved for Carthage itself, and the swift, decisive punishments meant to secure his authority instead accelerate exactly the erosion of trust he most needed to prevent. There is a darker, quieter thread running beneath all of this political unraveling too. One that ancient historians note without fully being able to explain the remaining Carthaginian forces on the island, rather than collapsing entirely. After the loss of Eryx, begin to regroup and hold their ground, with unexpected resilience, and Pyrrhus finds that the final, decisive campaign he expected to finish Carthage's presence on Sicily for good keeps slipping just out of reach, bogged down in the same kind of grinding, resource-draining warfare that had already exhausted him once before in Italy. The quick welcomed conquest that felt so different from the brutal attrition of the Roman campaign is starting uncomfortably to resemble it after all. And here is a moment of dry, weary irony, worth sitting with the kind of detail that would earn a knowing, slightly sad laugh from any careful listener. Following this story from the beginning, Pyrrhus, who once described to Cineas his grand plan to conquer Italy, then Sicily, then Carthage itself, and it finally rest, now finds himself precisely in the middle of that fantasy. On the island meant to be merely a stepping stone toward Carthage, discovering that ruling even a single conquered territory well enough to keep its people loyal is proving far harder than conquering it in the first place. Sicily was supposed to be the easy chapter, the grateful, welcoming counterpoint to Italy's exhausting stalemate. Instead, it is curdling into something disturbingly familiar, a population that no longer trusts him, a war against Carthage that refuses to reach a clean conclusion, and a growing sense, even among his own closest advisors, that the island's patience with its self-appointed king is running out, far faster than Pyrrhus's ambition ever anticipated it would. Word begins reaching Pyrrhus during this uneasy stretch that Italy, the campaign he left behind with vague promises of eventual return, has not simply waited patiently for him. Rome has used the intervening years to steadily recover ground, pressuring the Greek cities and allied territories he left under only nominal protection, and Tarentum itself, the very city whose plea started this entire saga, is reportedly sending increasingly desperate messages, begging him to return before what remains of his Italian position collapses entirely. Pyrrhus finds himself now caught between two unraveling situations at once: a Sicilian kingdom curdling into suspicion and resentment behind him, and an Italian war reigniting without him ahead. And the decision he is about to make, whether to abandon the island he fought so spectacularly hard to win, will define the final grinding chapter of a campaign that once promised him everything, The decision to leave Sicily does not arrive as a single dramatic moment, so much as a slow, grinding recognition that the island he fought so hard to win has become in the space of barely 3 years, almost as untenable as the war he originally left behind in Italy. And here is what you have to understand about the position Pyrrhus finds himself in during this final Sicilian stretch. The goodwill that once carried him from city to city as a welcomed liberator has curdled so thoroughly that he can no longer trust the loyalty of the very population he came to save. The remaining Carthaginian resistance refuses to collapse, no matter how much of his dwindling army he throws against it and Italy. The campaign he abandoned with vague promises of return is unraveling behind him at a pace that suggests there may soon be nothing left there worth returning to at all. Ancient sources preserve a particular remark attributed to Pyrrhus during this period of mounting frustration, one that captures with unusual precision the exact bind he has talked himself into across this entire Western adventure. Surveying the situation on the island, Sicilian allies growing openly hostile, Carthage still standing despite years of costly campaigning against it, Pyrrhus reportedly compares Sicily and Italy to two wrestlers locked in an exhausting match, and remarks with weary, self-aware bitterness that he is leaving behind a fine wrestling ground for the Carthaginians and the Romans to keep fighting over between themselves. It is a rare flash of genuine self-awareness from a man who has spent this entire story chasing horizons that keep receding exactly as fast as he approaches them. And it lands with a particular uncomfortable irony, given how thoroughly Pyrrhus himself has just spent the last several years demonstrating exactly that same restless, unsatisfiable pattern. The retreat from Sicily is not simple. Carthaginian naval forces, aware that Pyrrhus intends to withdraw his army back across the strait to Italy, attempt to intercept his fleet during the crossing, and the resulting engagement costs him a significant number of ships and men before he even sets foot back on Italian soil, a final, bitter toll extracted from a campaign that began with such spectacular promise at the walls of Eryx and ends, instead, in a chaotic, costly scramble simply to get his remaining forces off the island in one piece. And here is the grim arithmetic worth sitting with as this section unfolds. Pyrrhus crosses back into Italy with a substantially smaller force than the one he originally brought to Sicily, itself already a diminished remnant of the grand invasion fleet that first set sail from Epirus years earlier. Every stage of this Western adventure has cost him men, resources, and irreplaceable veteran soldiers, and he is returning now to a war in Italy that has had years to recover, reorganize, and prepare for exactly this moment. Rome, during Pyrrhus's absence, has not simply waited. The Senate has used the intervening years with the same patient, methodical discipline that so unsettled Cineas during his embassy years earlier, rebuilding legions, reasserting control over wavering allied territories that had briefly considered defecting to Pyrrhus's side after Heraclea and Asculum, and steadily squeezing the remaining pro-Pyrrhus factions across southern Italy back into isolated, defensible pockets. Tarentum, the city whose plea started this entire saga, finds its own position badly weakened, no longer the confident, wealthy patron that once believed it could simply purchase a champion's services and let him handle the unpleasant business of actual fighting. And here is the darkly fitting irony worth noting, a callback to that very first insult that started this whole war. The Tarentines who once mocked a Roman ambassador's ruined toga in their theatre now find their own city besieged by the very power they once treated with such careless contempt, their fate increasingly tied to whether a tired, depleted foreign king can somehow manage one more military miracle on their behalf. Pyrrhus, arriving back on Italian soil, does what he has always done throughout this entire story. When faced with diminishing resources and mounting pressure, he pushes forward anyway, gathering what remains of his scattered Italian alliances, reinforcing his depleted ranks as best he can with whatever local support still remains willing to fight alongside him, and preparing to meet Rome once more in the kind of decisive field engagement that has defined every major turning point of this campaign since Heraclea. But here is what you have to understand about how differently this confrontation is shaping up compared to those earlier battles, and it is worth sitting with the weight of this contrast before we move forward into what follows at Heraclea. Pyrrhus arrived with a fresh, full-strength army, facing a Rome that had never seen his tactics before. At Asculum, he still commanded enough veteran strength to force a costly but genuine battlefield victory. Now returning from Sicily exhausted, diminished, and facing a Roman army that has spent years specifically studying and adapting to counter every tactic that once terrified them, Pyrrhus is walking toward a confrontation with almost none of the advantages that carried him through the earlier chapters of this war. And here is the quiet mounting dread worth sitting with, as this section closes, the kind of tension that any careful listener following this story should feel gathering now, like storm clouds on the horizon. Rome has learned. The soldiers who once panicked at the mere sight and smell of war elephants have now faced them twice before and developed countermeasures specifically designed to blunt their terror. The commanders who once scrambled to adapt their tactics mid-battle have had years to study exactly how Pyrrhus fights, exactly where his phalanx proves vulnerable, exactly what kind of terrain and formation might finally neutralize the advantages that won him 2 field victories despite their staggering cost. Pyrrhus is marching now weakened and worn down by years of grinding campaign across 2 different theatres of war toward an enemy that has spent that same span of years growing only stronger, only more prepared, only more determined to finally settle, once and for all, the question this entire saga has been circling since that very first clash of arms on the misty plain outside Heraclea. Near a town called Beneventum, that reckoning is about to arrive. The Roman camp near Beneventum, in the days before this final confrontation, is commanded by a consul named Manius Curius Dentatus, a man whose reputation for stern, old-fashioned Roman discipline precedes him almost as thoroughly as Pyrrhus's own reputation for battlefield brilliance precedes the Epirot king. And here is what you have to understand about the strategic picture as both armies converge on this stretch of ground in southern Italy. Curius commands a Roman force that has had years to prepare specifically for this rematch, while Pyrrhus arrives leading an army that is in almost every measurable way a shadow of the force that first crossed the sea from Epirus, depleted by 2 costly victories, bled further by the exhausting Sicilian campaign, and now facing an enemy that knows exactly what it is walking into, rather than the shocked, unprepared legions of Heraclea. Pyrrhus, recognizing his own weakened position, attempts something bold and characteristically decisive, rather than settling into a cautious, drawn-out standoff, a night march intending to catch a portion of the Roman army by surprise, before it can properly organize its defenses, striking at a moment when Roman discipline and preparation might matter less than sheer speed and audacity. It is exactly the kind of high-risk, high-reward maneuver that has defined Pyrrhus's entire military career, the willingness to gamble everything on a single decisive stroke, rather than grinding through a longer, safer campaign. And here is where the plan begins to unravel in a way that feels, by this point in the story, almost tragically familiar. The terrain works against him precisely as it worked against Rome back at Asculum, except now the disadvantage belongs entirely to Pyrrhus. His guides lose their way in the darkness. The army becomes strung out and disorganized, moving through unfamiliar wooded terrain at night, and by the time dawn breaks, the element of surprise that was supposed to be his decisive advantage has evaporated, entirely replaced instead by an exhausted, disorganized force stumbling into position just as the fully alert Roman army is ready and waiting for. To them, the battle that follows unfolds across difficult broken ground, much like Asculum, but this time without the tactical adjustments that once let Pyrrhus force the fighting onto more favorable terrain. Curius, employing exactly the kind of patient, disciplined Roman tactics that so unsettled Cineas years earlier during his embassy to the Senate, holds a strong defensive position and lets Pyrrhus's tired, diminished forces exhaust themselves attempting to break through. And here is the moment where this battle turns, decisively, the moment worth picturing with real clarity because it closes a circle that has been open since the very first section of this story. Pyrrhus commits his elephants once more, the same devastating weapon that shattered Roman cavalry and infantry alike at Heraclea and again at Asculum, expecting the same terrified panic that has served him so reliably in every previous engagement. This time it does not work. The Romans, having now faced these creatures twice before, and spent years specifically preparing countermeasures. Meet the elephant charge with disciplined volleys of javelins and fire-tipped missiles aimed specifically at the animals, rather than their handlers wounding and panicking several of the great beasts before they can reach the main Roman line. And here is the detail that turns this from simple battlefield setback into genuine catastrophe for Pyrrhus's entire army. One or more of the wounded, panicked elephants, rather than continuing forward into the enemy, turn back in blind, terror and pain crashing directly into Pyrrhus's own advancing ranks, trampling through friendly formations in exactly the kind of chaotic, uncontrollable stampede that every elephant handler in every ancient army secretly feared and every enemy commander secretly hoped for. The very weapon that had won Pyrrhus 2 field victories against impossible odds now turns in one horrific reversal against the army it was meant to protect. The psychological and tactical effect is immediate and devastating. Pyrrhus's already exhausted, already diminished forces thrown into chaos by their own stampeding elephants, and facing a Roman army that senses the battle finally turning decisively in its favor after years of costly, humiliating defeats, begin to break and scatter. Curious presses the advantage without hesitation, and what began as a difficult but survivable engagement collapses by the battle's end into the first genuine, unambiguous defeat Pyrrhus has suffered since crossing into Italy years earlier. The Romans reportedly capture several of the surviving elephants' intact animals that will later be paraded through the streets of Rome itself as living trophies of a war that once seemed after Heraclea, almost unwinnable for the young republic. And here is what you have to understand about why this single battle, more than either of the 2 costly victories that preceded it, truly marks the end of Pyrrhus's Italian ambitions. This is not another Pyrrhic victory, another triumph, purchased at unsustainable cost. This is simple, unambiguous defeat, and Pyrrhus no longer commands anything close to the force needed to absorb it and continue fighting. The veteran corps that survived Heraclea and Asculum, already thinned by years of grinding attrition and the costly Sicilian detour, is now shattered beyond any realistic hope of reconstitution. There will be no third field battle, no third demonstration of tactical brilliance snatching victory from difficult circumstances. The war in every practical sense that matters ends on this field near Beneventum. There is a small bitter irony worth noting here too, the kind of detail that closes a circle stretching all the way back to Cineas's gentle, devastating question before this entire expedition ever began. Pyrrhus once described to his advisor a grand vision of conquering Italy, then Sicily, then Carthage, before finally resting. He has now fought his way through versions of nearly every stage of that fantasy, Italy, Sicily, and endless costly battles in between, and arrives at this final defeat, having gained in the end none of it permanently, none of the rest he once joked about, only the exhausted wreckage of an army that crossed the sea years earlier, believing it was marching toward the same kind of eternal glory that once carried Alexander from Greece to India. Pyrrhus, standing amid the wreckage of his own broken formations at Beneventum, now faces a question with only one honest answer left: whether there is anything left in Italy worth staying to fight for at all. The retreat from Beneventum carries none of the strategic calculation that marked Pyrrhus's earlier departure from Sicily, none of that weary but composed remark about leaving 2 wrestlers to fight over an abandoned ground. This is simply withdrawal, the plain, unadorned collection of whatever remains of an army that crossed into Italy years earlier, believing itself capable of reshaping the entire Western Mediterranean. And here is what you have to understand about the scale of what Pyrrhus is actually bringing home, because the numbers tell a story more brutal than any battlefield account could. Of the roughly 20,000 infantry and several thousand cavalry that first landed on Italian shores, along with the 20 war elephants that once seemed to guarantee victory, wherever they charged, only a small fraction now remains fit to sail back across the sea. Ancient sources suggest he returns to Epirus with perhaps 8,000 infantry and a few hundred cavalry, a shadow of the force that once made even Rome's Senate briefly consider suing for peace. Picture the scene at the docks in Epirus as this remnant army disembarks, because it stands in such stark, deliberate contrast to the scene We opened this entire story with, years and sections earlier, the confident departure, the elephants, being carefully loaded, the grand ambition of a king convinced he was stepping into Alexander's own destiny. Now the ships return carrying exhausted, wounded veterans, far fewer elephants than departed, and a king who has spent 6 years, by most reckonings, chasing glory across 2 different theatres of war, and returned with neither Italy nor Sicily permanently secured, neither Rome nor Carthage meaningfully weakened in any lasting way, and an army so depleted that Epirus itself now sits considerably more vulnerable than it did before this entire Western adventure ever began. And here is what you have to understand about the deeper cost of this failure, the one that goes beyond simple battlefield arithmetic. Pyrrhus set out from Epirus, originally framing this campaign as a defense of Greek freedom against Roman and Carthaginian encroachment, a noble cause dressed in the language of protecting fellow Hellenes from barbarian domination. What he leaves behind tells a considerably less flattering story. Tarentum, the city whose plea started this entire saga, remains under continued Roman pressure. Its eventual fall to Rome now looking less like a distant possibility and more like an inevitability. Pyrrhus's departure has simply hastened. The Sicilian Greek cities he once liberated to such enthusiastic welcome now regard him, following the souring of that relationship, with the same wary suspicion once reserved for actual foreign conquerors. Rather than defending Greek freedom in the West, Pyrrhus's intervention has arguably left both Italy and Sicily in a weaker, more precarious position than if he had never crossed the sea at all. Rome having used the war as an opportunity to demonstrate its resilience, and Carthage having simply waited out a threat that eventually removed itself. There is a dry, weary irony worth sitting with here, the kind that would earn a rueful nod from anyone who has followed this story from its very beginning. The phrase Pyrrhus, coined after Asculum, warning that one more victory like that would ruin him utterly, turns out to have been more prophetic than even he likely intended in the moment. It was not in the end one more costly victory that finished him. It was the accumulated weight of every victory, every campaign, every fresh horizon chased across 6 exhausting years, each one draining resources and irreplaceable veteran soldiers that could never quite be replenished quickly enough to keep pace with his own relentless ambition, Rome, patient and institutionally deep, in a way Pyrrhus never fully reckoned with, even after Cineas's warning. All those years earlier simply outlasted him, absorbing blow after blow and continuing to stand, while the brilliant, restless king, who delivered those blows, eventually ran out of army to deliver them with. And here is a detail worth including, for its bitter, almost darkly comic texture, the sort of thing ancient historians preserved, because it captured something essential about how quickly fortunes could reverse in this world: the war elephants, captured by the Romans at Beneventum, the same creatures that once sent Roman cavalry into blind panic at Heraclea, are marched through the streets of Rome itself as trophies of victory, curious crowds gathering to gawk at animals that had, for a brief stretch of years, represented the single most terrifying weapon the Roman military had ever encountered. The beasts that once seemed to herald the possible end of Roman power in Italy now serve instead as living proof of exactly the opposite outcome, paraded as evidence of a threat successfully weathered and overcome. Pyrrhus himself, arriving back in Epirus, faces the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent 6 years chasing a destiny that never quite materialized, returning not to triumph, but to the considerably smaller, considerably less glorious reality of ruling the same modest mountain kingdom he set out from in the first place. And here is what you have to understand about why this homecoming, rather than settling him, only seems to deepen the restlessness that has defined his entire life. Pyrrhus is a man constitutionally incapable of finding satisfaction in simply holding what he already has. The Italian campaign, for all its catastrophic cost, it was never really about Tarentum, or even about defeating Rome specifically. It was about the same hunger that has driven him since childhood. Exile, the same comparison to Alexander that has haunted every decision of his adult life, and that hunger does not simply disappear because one campaign has ended in exhausted failure. Epirus, small and diminished, and licking its own wounds from 6 years of war fought almost entirely on someone else's soil, is about to discover that its restless king has already begun looking for the next horizon even before the last one has finished costing him everything. Epirus, in the months following Pyrrhus's return, is a kingdom quietly taking stock of what 6 years of foreign war have actually cost it, and the accounting is not pleasant. The treasury that once funded 20 war elephants and tens of thousands of soldiers now sits considerably emptier. The veteran corps of professional soldiers that made Epirus's small mountain kingdom punch so far above its actual size on the international stage has been bled down to a fraction of its former strength, scattered across battlefields in Italy and Sicily that Pyrrhus no longer controls. And here is what you have to understand about the particular danger this creates for a king. In Pyrrhus's exact position, an exhausted, depleted kingdom is precisely the kind of target that invites exactly the sort of opportunistic aggression Pyrrhus himself specialized in throughout his younger 2 years, and it does not take long for that danger to arrive from an entirely predictable direction. Macedon, the powerful kingdom to the northeast that Pyrrhus had briefly ruled a portion of years earlier during the chaotic churn of Hellenistic succession disputes, is once again in a state of vulnerable transition. Its current ruler, a king named Antigonus Gonatas, holds a throne that many of his rivals across the Greek world consider far from secure. Macedon, having cycled through an exhausting series of kings and pretenders in the decades since Alexander's death, left the entire region in perpetual unresolved contest. And here is exactly the kind of opportunity that Pyrrhus, restless and dissatisfied barely months after returning from the most exhausting failure of his career, finds himself constitutionally unable to resist a nearby throne. Contested and vulnerable, occupied by a king whose grip on power looks considerably weaker than Pyrrhus's own reputation as one of the most formidable battlefield commanders of the age. The dry, weary irony here deserves a moment of its own, the kind of observation that would earn a knowing, slightly exasperated laugh from anyone who has followed this entire story from its beginning. Pyrrhus has just spent 6 catastrophic years learning in the most painful and expensive way imaginable that conquest without consolidation is a trap, that winning battles means nothing if you cannot hold what you have won, that his own hero Alexander's endless, restless marching left behind an empire that shattered into exactly the kind of chaotic succession warfare Pyrrhus himself has spent his entire adult life exploiting. And yet here he is, mere months after limping home from Italy with a fraction of the army he set out with, already assembling forces to march on yet another throne, apparently having absorbed none of the hard lesson his own life has just spent 6 brutal years teaching him. The campaign against Macedon unfolds with considerably less bloodshed and considerably more speed than the grinding years-long Italian war that preceded it, and this itself tells you something important about the different scale of ambition at play. Pyrrhus does not need to build an entirely new invasion force or transport elephants across a storm-tossed sea. He simply needs to exploit existing discontent among Antigonus Gonatas's own soldiers and nobles, many of whom, according to ancient accounts, prove remarkably willing to abandon their king the moment a more famous, more battle-tested commander appears on their doorstep, offering an alternative. Antigonus's mercenary soldiers reportedly desert to Pyrrhus's side in significant numbers, rather than risk their lives defending a throne they were never especially loyal to in the first place, and what might have been a difficult, costly war instead collapses with startling speed into something closer to a swift change of regime. Pyrrhus finds himself remarkably wearing the crown of Macedon itself within a relatively short span of time, ruling over the very kingdom that once stood at the absolute center of Alexander's own legacy, the heartland from which the greatest conqueror in Greek history once launched his campaign against the Persian Empire. And here is what you have to understand about how this moment should feel. If Pyrrhus's own stated ambitions across this entire story mean anything at all, this ought to represent something close to the pinnacle of everything. He has spent his life chasing a throne intimately connected to Alexander's own inheritance, won with a fraction of the cost and bloodshed that Italy demanded and secured for once. not through some distant foreign war fought largely for other people's benefit, but through a direct personal conquest close to home. And yet here is the pattern that anyone following this story closely should recognize immediately: the same restless dissatisfaction that has defined every single chapter of Pyrrhus's adult life. The throne of Macedon does not seem to satisfy him any more thoroughly or permanently than any of his previous conquests ever did. Ancient sources describe him treating the Macedonian kingship with a kind of casual, almost dismissive attitude, more interested in using Macedon's resources and manpower to fund further military adventures than in the actual patient work of governing the kingdom well, securing its borders, or building the kind of lasting loyalty among his new subjects that might have let this conquest actually stick. There is a particularly telling detail preserved in the ancient sources worth including here, one that captures something essential about Pyrrhus's relationship to power itself. He reportedly allows his newly won Macedonian soldiers, men who had just abandoned their previous king, to follow him to plunder royal tombs at Aegae, the ancient burial site of Macedonian kings stretching back generations, an act of casual desecration that shocks and alienates, exactly the kind of deep-rooted Macedonian loyalty a wiser, more patient ruler would have worked carefully to cultivate rather than casually discard. It is the action of a man who sees a kingdom primarily as a resource to be extracted rather than a trust to be honored, and it plants seeds of resentment among his new subjects that will not take long to bear bitter fruit. Pyrrhus, having achieved what should represent the crowning triumph of his entire career, already finds his attention drifting elsewhere, within remarkably short order, restless energy, searching for the next challenge worthy of his reputation, even as the throne he just won sits barely secured beneath. And, south across the Peloponnese, in a legendary city whose name alone carries centuries of martial reputation, an opportunity is about to present itself that Pyrrhus, true to every pattern this story has traced since his infancy, will find utterly impossible to resist. A city called Sparta, and a conquest that Pyrrhus assumes with the same fatal overconfidence that has shadowed every triumph of his career, will prove easy. The Macedonian throne, for all the speed and relative ease with which Pyrrhus won, it proves in practice to be exactly the kind of possession his restless temperament has never handled well. Not a home, but a way station, a resource to be drawn upon rather than a kingdom to be patiently built and defended. And here is what you have to understand about the particular strangeness of this moment in Pyrrhus's life, something worth sitting with before we watch him abandon it entirely. This is the closest he has ever come in this entire story to actually achieving the destiny he spent his childhood dreaming about, ruling the very heartland from which Alexander himself once marched out to conquer the known world. Any other king having climbed this far might have paused here, consolidated his position, spent years securing Macedon's borders, and building the kind of deep loyalty among his new subjects that could turn a hastily won crown into a lasting dynasty. Pyrrhus does none of this. Ancient sources describe him governing Macedon with the same restless, distracted energy he has shown toward every previous kingdom. He has held more interested in the throne's usefulness as a source of soldiers and resources for whatever comes next, than in the unglamorous, patient work of actual administration. And here is the dry, uncomfortable irony worth pausing on, the kind of observation that closes yet another circle in this story. Pyrrhus, who so admired Alexander that he modelled his entire life around matching that legendary conqueror's glory, seems to have absorbed only half of Alexander's example. He has the restless ambition, the willingness to march toward the next impossible target, the personal battlefield courage. What he has never once demonstrated across every single kingdom this story has watched him win and then abandon is Alexander's occasional capacity, however imperfect, to actually govern what he had conquered, to build administrative structures that outlasted the immediate thrill of victory. The plundering of the royal tombs at Aegae, mentioned at the close of the previous chapter of this story, continues to cast a long shadow over Pyrrhus's brief tenure as Macedonian king, a wound to Macedonian pride and religious sensibility that does not simply fade because the soldiers responsible eventually move on to other campaigns. And here is what you have to understand about why this single act of casual desecration matters so much more than it might first appear. Macedonian identity, Macedonian loyalty to its royal line, runs through exactly this kind of sacred connection to ancestors and lineage, the same royal burial traditions that once made Alexander's own funeral such an enormously significant political event across the fractured post-Alexander world. Pyrrhus treating this sacred ground as simply another resource to be extracted for immediate soldierly gain alienates precisely the deep well of traditional loyalty that might have otherwise cushioned his rule against whatever challenges eventually came his way. Those challenges arrive predictably enough by this point in the story from exactly the direction Pyrrhus's own history should have taught him to expect a rival claimant to the Macedonian throne backed by shifting regional alliances, begins contesting his hold on the kingdom almost as soon as the initial momentum of his swift conquest starts to fade. And here is the pattern, by now thoroughly familiar to anyone who has followed this entire story from its very first section. Pyrrhus, rather than digging in to defend what he has won through the patient, unglamorous work of securing loyalty and administration fines, his attention already wandering toward a different, shinier prospect entirely, one that has nothing whatsoever to do with the very real challenges building against his Macedonian throne. That prospect arrives in the form of an invitation, and it is worth noting the persistent, almost compulsive pattern this represents in Pyrrhus's life by this point. Yet another faction within yet another kingdom, dissatisfied with its current internal politics, reaches out to the most famous, most battle-tested general in the Greek world, hoping his reputation and military skill might resolve a dispute they cannot settle among themselves. This time the invitation comes from within Sparta itself, the legendary city-state, whose martial reputation has echoed across the Greek world for centuries, built on the memory of warriors like those who once held the pass at Thermopylae against overwhelming odds. A rival claimant to the Spartan throne, a man named Cleonymus, aggrieved at having been passed over for kingship in favor of a relative, approaches Pyrrhus with an offer to help install him as Sparta's ruler instead. And here is what you have to understand about how thoroughly Pyrrhus's own restless character shapes this decision more than any careful strategic calculation about Macedon's actual vulnerabilities or Sparta's actual military strength. Sparta, by this point in history, is no longer the dominant military power it was centuries earlier during its legendary Golden Age, its population and manpower having declined significantly over generations of warfare and internal social strain. Pyrrhus, hearing Cleonymus's plea, almost certainly assumes this will be a swift, relatively easy campaign, another quick regime change, like the one that handed him Macedon's crown with minimal bloodshed, a chance to add Sparta's legendary name to his own growing reputation before returning presumably to properly secure the Macedonian throne he has already begun neglecting. It is worth pausing here before we watch this next campaign unfold on the sheer overconfidence baked into this decision, because it represents perhaps the clearest single example in this entire story of Pyrrhus's fatal blind spot finally catching up with him in earnest. He has by this point won and then carelessly discarded an Italian campaign, a Sicilian kingdom, and is now actively neglecting a Macedonian throne each time, convinced that the next conquest will finally deliver the lasting glory the previous one somehow failed to provide. Sparta, ancient and proud and far more dangerous than its diminished modern reputation might suggest to an overconfident visitor, is about to teach Pyrrhus one of the harshest lessons of his entire turbulent career. And this time the lesson will not simply cost him an army or a kingdom, but very nearly his life. Pyrrhus marches south into the Peloponnese at the head of a substantial army, 25,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry by most ancient accounts, along with a fresh contingent of war elephants, a force considerably larger than what such a supposedly straightforward regime change campaign would seem to require. And here is what you have to understand about the assumption riding alongside every soldier in that column. Pyrrhus expects this to be easy. Sparta, in his mind, and in the minds of most observers across the Greek world at this point in history, is a shadow of its legendary former self. its citizen population dramatically reduced from the days when 300 Spartan warriors could hold a mountain pass against the entire Persian army. Its military reputation now resting more on inherited myth than on any recent demonstration of actual battlefield dominance. He arrives outside the city, expecting by several ancient accounts to simply walk in with minimal resistance, perhaps even planning initially to bypass an actual siege entirely and negotiate Cleonymus's installation as king through political pressure backed by the mere presence of his overwhelming army. And here is the detail that catches him entirely off guard. The first sign that this campaign is not going to unfold according to the easy script he had written for it in his own head. Unlike every other city and kingdom, this story has watched, welcome, or crumble before Pyrrhus's reputation. Sparta simply refuses to be intimidated. The Spartan king, currently on the throne along with the city's governing council, flatly rejects any suggestion of accommodation, and the city begins with startling speed and determination, preparing to defend itself rather than negotiate. Picture the scene inside Sparta's walls during those frantic preparatory days, because it deserves real attention. One of the more striking and lesser-known details of this entire story, with the Spartan king and most able-bodied men away on other business, when Pyrrhus's approach is first reported, it falls to the city's women to organize much of the initial defense, digging a deep trench around the exposed portion of the city and reinforcing it with wagons buried up to their axles to block cavalry and elephant approaches. Ancient sources describe Spartan women working through the night alongside the elderly, and those men still present, refusing offers to be evacuated to safety, insisting instead on contributing directly to the city's defense. It is a detail historians still find remarkable even now, cutting sharply against easy assumptions about gender and combat in the ancient world, and it captures something essential about the fierce, stubborn character of a city Pyrrhus had badly underestimated. The assault itself, when it finally comes, unfolds across brutal, close, desperate fighting that bears almost no resemblance to the easy conquest Pyrrhus had anticipated. His forces attempt repeatedly to breach the hastily constructed defenses, elephants and cavalry struggling against the trench and wagon barricades in terrain deliberately shaped to neutralize exactly the advantages that had served him so devastatingly well against Rome years earlier. Spartan defenders, badly outnumbered and lacking anything close to Pyrrhus's professional military strength, fight with a ferocity that surprises even seasoned observers. Holding their improvised barricades through wave after wave of assault, the fighting reportedly continuing in fits and starts across multiple days as Pyrrhus searches for any weakness in defenses that simply refuse to break. And here is a moment of genuine, striking human drama preserved in the ancient accounts, worth picturing vividly at one particularly desperate point in the fighting. Pyrrhus's own son Ptolemy, leading a contingent of troops in the assault, is killed in the fierce combat around the Spartan defenses, a personal loss that strikes Pyrrhus with a grief the ancient sources describe as genuinely devastating, momentarily shattering the calculated tactical composure that has carried him through every previous battle in this story. Enraged and grieving in equal measure, Pyrrhus reportedly throws himself even more recklessly into the fighting that follows. Driven now by something closer to personal fury than strategic calculation, a shift in temperament that only makes the already brutal fighting around Sparta's walls even more desperate and costly for both sides. Reinforcements eventually begin arriving to bolster Sparta's defense, additional forces sent from allied cities, and from Macedon's rival, Antigonus Gonatus, who sees clear strategic advantage in helping bleed his old adversary. Pyrrhus against Spartan walls rather than facing him directly, himself. And here is what you have to understand about the accumulating toll of this unexpected siege on Pyrrhus's own position, one that should feel achingly familiar by this point in the story. Every day spent grinding against Sparta's stubborn, unbroken defenses is a day Pyrrhus is not spending securing his still shaky hold on the Macedonian throne he left behind. A day that gives his Macedonian rivals more time to consolidate opposition against him. A day added to a mounting pile of resources and irreplaceable soldiers spent on yet another campaign that was supposed to be quick and decisive and has, instead become another grinding, costly stalemate against an enemy that simply refuses to yield. Word eventually reaches Pyrrhus in the midst of this frustrating, increasingly costly siege of fresh political turmoil developing in the nearby city of Argos, where a succession dispute has erupted into open factional conflict, and where one side of that dispute is now appealing directly to him for military support, offering him a path into the city and a chance to extend his influence even further across the Peloponnese. And here is the pattern one final time playing out, with an almost eerie inevitability given everything this story has traced across 17 sections now. Rather than settling the unfinished business at Sparta, rather than accepting that this particular conquest has simply failed and withdrawing to properly secure what he actually holds, Pyrrhus turns his attention toward yet another shiny new opportunity, abandoning the Spartan siege only, partially resolved, and marching his exhausted, already badly bloodied army toward Argos instead. It is a decision that will carry him within a matter of days into the final and most bizarre chapter of his entire extraordinary life. The city of Argos, as Pyrrhus's exhausted army approaches it, is caught in exactly the kind of chaotic internal factional dispute that has throughout this entire story proven so irresistible to a man who has built his entire career on inserting himself into other people's succession crises. And here is what you have to understand about the specific danger of this particular invitation, one that Pyrrhus, weary and grieving, and increasingly desperate for some kind of decisive success after the humiliating stalemate at Sparta, does not seem to weigh carefully enough before accepting it. Argos is not simply offering him an open door. The city is deeply divided, various factions maneuvering against each other, and Antigonus Gonatas, Pyrrhus's old Macedonian rival, is also moving his own forces toward the city at almost exactly the same time, recognizing the same opportunity Pyrrhus has spotted and equally unwilling to let his adversary claim it uncontested. Both armies converge on Argos in a tense, uneasy standoff, and the city's own leadership, caught between two powerful foreign kings, each maneuvering to exploit its internal divisions, attempts something that might have actually worked. Under calmer circumstances, negotiating with both Pyrrhus and Antigonus simultaneously, urging each to withdraw his forces and allow the Argives to settle their own political disputes without foreign armies camped at their gates. Antigonus, weighing the situation with considerably more caution than his old rival has ever shown across this entire story, agrees to pull back rather than risk a costly confrontation over a prize that may not be worth the fight. Pyrrhus, true to the restless, all-or-nothing character that has defined every single chapter of his life since that first desperate river crossing as an infant, does not. Instead, under cover of darkness, Pyrrhus makes a decision that will prove to be the final, fatal miscalculation of his entire extraordinary career. Rather than withdrawing as agreed, he attempts to seize the city through stealth, arranging for one of the Argive factions sympathetic to his cause to open a gate and let his forces slip inside during the night, hoping to secure control of Argos before Antigonus or anyone else can react. And here is where the plan begins to unravel almost immediately in a manner that should feel painfully, achingly familiar by this point in the story. The same kind of chaotic, poorly coordinated nighttime maneuver that once cost him the element of surprise at Beneventum now repeats itself with even more catastrophic consequences. The gate proves too narrow and awkward for his elephants to pass through easily, forcing frustrating delays as handlers struggle to get the massive animals through streets never designed to accommodate them. And by the time a meaningful portion of his army has actually made it inside the city walls, the alarm has been raised and Argos has erupted into exactly the kind of chaotic, confused urban combat that no general, however brilliant, on an open battlefield can fully control. Picture the scene inside Argos that night, because it is genuinely one of the strangest and most chaotic set pieces in this entire story. Narrow, winding streets never designed for large-scale battle soldiers from multiple different armies and multiple different city factions, all tangled together. In the darkness, unable to clearly distinguish friend from enemy, fighting breaking out in confused, isolated pockets across the entire city, rather than the organized formations Pyrrhus has spent his entire career mastering. Elephants, panicked by the noise and confusion, and cramped surroundings, become uncontrollable in ways that echo with grim and deliberate symmetry the exact disaster that doomed him at Beneventum years earlier. One particularly large elephant reportedly collapses in a narrow gateway after its handler is killed, blocking the passage entirely and trapping soldiers on both sides of the resulting chaos, adding yet another layer of confusion to an already catastrophically disorganized engagement. Antigonus's forces, along with Argive defenders and reinforcements, close in around Pyrrhus's trapped and scattered troops as dawn approaches, and Pyrrhus himself, according to Plutarch's detailed account, finds himself caught in the thick of exactly the kind of desperate, chaotic, close combat that has defined his entire battlefield career, fighting his way through narrow streets crowded with panicked soldiers and confused civilians. And here is the moment that closes this entire extraordinary story, and it deserves to be told with the full weight of its strange, almost absurd irony. Pyrrhus, a man who has survived assassination attempts as an infant near drowning, during a storm-tossed sea crossing, personal single combat atop the walls of an supposedly impregnable fortress, and countless brutal battles against the finest armies of his era, meets his end. Not through some grand decisive stroke on an open battlefield, but in a moment of almost domestic, tragically mundane chaos. According to the most widely preserved account, Pyrrhus, fighting in the confused street combat, is struck by a roof tile hurled down from above by an elderly Argive woman watching the chaos unfold from her home, desperate to protect her own son who is fighting somewhere in the melee below. The blow, though perhaps not fatal on its own, stuns him badly enough that he is thrown from his horse or otherwise incapacitated, and in the confused, brutal moments that follow, an enemy soldier finds him in that vulnerable state and finishes what the roof tile started, killing the man who was once compared to Alexander the Great, who once made even Rome's Senate briefly consider suing for peace in a narrow, unremarkable street, cut down not by a legendary rival general or a decisive tactical masterstroke, but essentially by chance, by an ordinary woman's desperate act of maternal protection and an anonymous soldier's opportunistic finishing blow. Historians still argue over the precise details of this final moment, whether the roof tile alone caused his death or merely set up the killing stroke that followed, but the essential, almost unbearable irony of the story remains unchanged. Regardless of which specific account you trust, a man who spent his entire life chasing the kind of grand, world-shaping destiny that Alexander achieved, who measured every triumph and every failure against that impossible standard, ends his extraordinary life, not on a battlefield worthy of the comparison, but in a chaotic, undignified street fight in a half-conquered city, killed in circumstances so strange and so far beneath the epic scale of his own ambitions that even ancient historians writing centuries later could not resist dwelling on the sheer tragic absurdity of it. The news of Pyrrhus's death spreads outward from that chaotic Argive street with the particular speed reserved for the fall of truly famous men, reaching royal courts and marketplaces across the entire Greek world within weeks, and the reactions it provokes tell you almost everything about the first strange, contradictory legacy this restless king leaves behind. Antigonus Gonatas, his old Macedonian rival, who had withdrawn so cautiously from Argos, rather than risk exactly this kind of chaotic confrontation, reportedly treats his fallen adversary's remains with genuine considerable respect once the fighting ends, honoring Pyrrhus's son by returning his father's ashes rather than treating them as simple spoils of war, a gesture that suggests even the men who spent years fighting against Pyrrhus recognized they had lost something rare when he died in that narrow street. And here is what you have to understand about how historians, both ancient and modern, have wrestled with Pyrrhus's legacy across the centuries. Since that strange night in Argos, almost nobody disputes his genuine, extraordinary military talent. Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who would later hand Rome its own string of devastating defeats generations after Pyrrhus's death, reportedly ranked Pyrrhus as one of the greatest commanders in history, placing him second only to Alexander himself when asked to name history's finest generals. An assessment that echoes with a certain poignant symmetry Pyrrhus's as pen, own long-ago answer to the exact same question about his own place relative to Alexander. Roman writers themselves, despite having fought bitterly against him, he could not resist a grudging admiration for his battlefield brilliance. The personal courage that saw him leading assaults himself rather than directing safely from the rear. The tactical inventiveness that produced 2 field victories against the finest army in the Mediterranean world, even in defeat. And yet here is the darker, more complicated thread running beneath all that genuine admiration, the one this entire story has traced across every single section since that first desperate river crossing. Pyrrhus's staggering tactical gifts were never matched by anything resembling strategic patience or the capacity to actually consolidate what he won. Every kingdom this story has watched him conquer Epirus itself, in his youth briefly, Macedon on 2 separate occasions, Sicily during that brief golden window of welcomed liberation, even the field victories against Rome that gave the world its most famous phrase for a hollow triumph. Every single one of them slipped away not because some superior enemy general outmaneuvered him, but because Pyrrhus himself could never resist the pull of the next horizon long enough to properly secure the one already in his grasp. Historians still argue, and will likely go on arguing for as long as this story continues to be told, over how to weigh that fundamental contradiction. Was Pyrrhus simply unlucky, a brilliant general born into an era where Rome's particular institutional resilience happened to make his specific brand of decisive battle warfare obsolete before he ever crossed the sea? Or was his own restless character that same compulsive hunger that carried a hunted infant across a flooded river and never once let him rest afterward? The true author of his own eventual undoing, a flaw baked so deeply into his nature, no amount of tactical brilliance could ever fully compensate for it. The honest answer, the one this entire story has tried to sit with rather than resolve too neatly, is probably some uncomfortable measure of both. What endures most permanently more than any specific battle or any particular kingdom won and lost is the phrase, Pyrrhus left behind, almost by accident, spoken in a moment of exhausted, clear-eyed honesty on a blood-soaked field in Apulia. Pyrrhic victory has long since outgrown the man and the war that produced it, used now across every language and every field of human endeavor to describe any triumph that costs more than it delivers, any success that leaves the winner functionally worse off than the effort required to achieve it. It is a strange kind of immortality for a man who measured his entire life against Alexander's legend, who wanted nothing less than to reshape the world the way his cousin once had. Pyrrhus never got his empire. He never got his rest, that quiet retirement with Cineas he once laughed off as a fantasy not worth pursuing when conquest still beckoned. What he got instead was a phrase, a permanent linguistic monument to the exact moment. Ambition finally outran sense, not the destiny. He chased across 2 seas and 3 kingdoms, but perhaps in its own strange way, a more honest reflection of who he actually was than any throne could have provided. And now, as we let this restless king finally rest, let the noise of Heraclea and Asculum and that chaotic Argive street fade slowly into the quiet distance behind us. The elephants have long since stopped their trumpeting. The rivers Pyrrhus once crossed in flight and in conquest alike have settled back into their gentle ordinary courses, indifferent now to the ambitions that once demanded so much of them. Somewhere across the darkened Mediterranean, the ruins of Tarentum and the walls of Sparta and the streets of Argos sit quiet under starlight, holding their old stories, the way old stones always do, patient and unhurried, asking nothing more of you than to simply let them rest alongside the man who once fought so hard and so uselessly to be remembered. You can let your own eyes close now too. There is no more marching to be done tonight, no more horizons calling you forward. The stars above are dimming gently toward morning, the world outside your window, settling into that same deep, unbothered quiet that has settled over every battlefield in this story. Every fallen king, every ambition that once burned so brightly and now asks only for stillness. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders soften into whatever is holding you. The past, all of it is finally at rest, and so now are you. The world is quiet. It is time for deep sleep.